very excited today to have Senator John Laird be with us. I'm just checking to see if he's here. Let's see.
Lisa, would you like me to just do a little preview for you of Senator Laird as he's approaching?
Sure, that would be that. Sure, we could have you do that, Kate. So for those who do not know, Kate Daniels is here with us, and she works for Senator Laird. And Kate, go ahead and give us some information. I've got some wonderful highlights too to share about his legislation. So if you'd like to take it away, though, please feel free.
I'll just start by saying, so I serve as a policy advisor to State Senator John Laird. And as most of you are familiar with, we went through a redistricting process. And so this year in 2024, he will be closing out the district that he was elected to serve in 2020. And so Senator Laird's district is going to change starting in the beginning of the year of 2025. And so how that's going to look different is his coverage in San Luis Obispo County changes somewhat. He gains all of San Benito County, and where he used to have a gap in the Salinas Valley of coverage that was Senator Caballero's coverage, he now will have the entire Salinas Valley. And so you'll likely see some shifts in where we are throughout the county, but Monterey County is intact at this point and moving forward with Senator Laird as your senator for the entirety of Monterey County. I don't know if he's going to get into some of the really important priorities he was able to fund this year, but it is something to note that Senator Laird was able to secure over $20 million in the state budget for projects that he'll probably describe to you in the 17th district, which is Senator Laird's district. Let's see what else I can share with you. I know, Lisa, for your introduction, you'll talk about his very successful year as senator, where all of his bills were signed into law by the governor, and he will likely talk a bit about some of those important pieces of legislation that he was able to author and successfully get signed into law by the governor. It is an election year, and perhaps you'll hear a little bit about that. Our assembly member is reelected every 2 years. Our senator is elected every 4 years. So that's of interest and of note. What else, Lisa? Is there anything else I can share with you without stealing any of Senator Laird's thunder?
I think you've covered a lot of what it was we were going to talk about. I was going to mention some of the bills that he has had signed by the governor and signed into legislation. So let's see, would you like to go ahead and talk about that, or would you like me to jump in?
Why don't you jump in for the introduction? Because within a minute now, he should be here.
All right. Well, then, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for your service with Senator Laird. You have done a tremendous amount for us around housing and water. So thank you very much. Okay. So I do want to do a little bit of just housekeeping for the way this is going to work today before we go into the proper introduction for Senator Laird, who literally on perfect timing has just arrived into the room. So Josie, while I have you put him on to spotlight, I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. So today, Senator Laird has a very short time to be with us, and we want to really maximize that time. So what we'll be doing is he'll be speaking for about half an hour, and then we will have about 15 minutes of Q&A. And the ask is that we keep all of the Q&A into the chat only so that we can maximize questions. And with that, I say, welcome, Senator Laird. I'm going to give a little bit of a quick introduction. Senator John Laird was sworn in, as Kate said, into the State District 17 on December 7th, 2020. He served as Secretary for the Natural Resources by Governor Jerry Brown from January 5th, 2011 until January 7th, 2019. He also served as member of the State Integrated Waste Management Board from 2008 to 2009, and he also taught state environmental policy at University of California, Santa Cruz, which, as somebody who works there, I can say his legacy continues on there. In 2002, he was elected as an assembly member for the 27th District, which included portions of Monterey, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz counties, and then he was reelected in 2004 and 2006. While serving the maximum 3 terms in the Assembly, he authored 82 bills that were signed into law. And he continues his impressive track record as state senator. All of the bills that he has authored and have been signed and put into legislation by the governor, as Kate was saying with us. And this includes legislation such as enhanced battery storage safety standards and state building emissions, enhanced safe cannabis consumptions, which is preventing children from consuming cannabis. He's built coastal resiliency and support for coastal communities. He's been a voice for the LGBTQ plus students and has increased public participation and disability access on the state board. And the last thing I will say before I turn this over to you, Senator, is that if you want to read more about this incredibly impressive legislation that Senator Laird continues to advocate for us, you can go to his website and look under press releases. And every time one of his legislations gets put into place, there's a press announcement. So thank you very much for your service, Senator Laird. I happily turn this over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me clearly? Is that working?
Hear you loud and clear. Thank
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate being with you all, and look forward to the questions. And there's a lot going on right now, and I think despite the fact that we're out of session, and I appreciate the shout out about bills, I actually, in the 3 years I've been back in the legislature, I've sent 47 bills to the governor. He signed 46 of them. I think the one he didn't sign was a big mistake, and he signed it this last year. So I feel like I'm in good shape, and I'm glad to see Kate. I couldn't do this. She and I really collaborate together on amazing things, and if in fact she turns out to join me in the ranks of elected officials, I'm going to be happy for all of you and sorry for me. So because she does an outstanding job. And I thought I would do a few things and then open it up to questions, because there's current events and then there's current events. And the Pajaro River has been a big one. And the interesting thing is we worked for the 2 years before the levee broke early this year to, for the first time in modern times, have a fully funded levee project. There's only 5 to 7 years levee protection, and we saw that this year on the current levee system. And so I did a bill with Robert Rivas's help in 2021 that did something that has never been done in the state before. The state bought out entirely the local share for funding a new levee project. And together with Jimmy Panetta and Zoe Lofgren, working to release the federal money through the Army Corps of Engineers, we had a fully funded project from the state and federal level. And then the local voters actually last year, with a 79% vote, taxed themselves to operate the system. So last October, a year ago, we celebrated on the levee with Senator Padilla and the people that I just mentioned, and celebrated a fully funded project. And I made the mistake of saying at the ceremony, I hope to God it doesn't rain before we can get this built. And unfortunately, it did. And so now that has put us in a place where Robert did a bill that I helped him on to expedite the permitting process so that this project can begin the minute the rain stopped this year. And the state has put in money. The Board of Supervisors just considered the $20 million for various things. I mean, one problem has been the school that was rebuilt or in Pajaro is $2 million short between the insurance money and the FEMA money. They're still 2 million short, and it looks like that might come from this, but we're working on things like that. So I also got $750,000 in the budget to continue the services to the people that were displaced at the fairgrounds. And so we're a little nervous because the Corps hasn't moved as fast as we thought it would. on the repairs before this winter storm, but everybody is on it, and we really hope that that happens. And so that has been front and center. And the storms themselves have been front and center. So I got money in the budget for planning. The county asked for it to be able to do planning on the Carmel River. I mentioned the Pajaro. We had big problems in Santa Cruz and Capitola. We got money there. We had a horrible problem in San Luis Obispo where the levee had to be notched to keep from flooding into low-income neighborhoods in Oceano, and Dawn Addis and I worked together to get money in the budget to deal with that levee project and make sure that it gets in place. And we're still working on a whole host of issues that are out of the storms. That has been sort of front and center in my bill on sea level rise planning that Lisa mentioned in the introduction that the governor signed, is really designed through the Coastal Commission and around the San Francisco Bay Area, the Bay Conservation Development Commission, BCDC, to make sure all planning going forward includes sea level rise, that we have these conversations about what could happen before it actually happens. And so that has been a big thing this year, and continuing our work on climate. And then the issue of homelessness is front and center. And I intend to go back and work on that when we go back into session next month. And the interesting split is that the state has been funding opportunities for long-term housing, which is vital. It is an underlying thing. But less emphasized is short-term shelter. And in Santa Cruz, which has the highest per capita homeless population of any city in the state of California, Mark Stone and I got money so that they could do the kind of temporary housing that the state wasn't otherwise supporting. And in the latest population count, the people on the streets dropped by a quarter in Santa Cruz, and they have safe parking. They have 2 different places with tents and safe camping. And I'm meeting with the county administrator later today and the head of social services, because the state emphasizes permanent housing. But in the coastal areas, there is not enough permanent housing given the housing market. And we have to make sure that temporary housing is part of the mix in coastal areas, or we are accepting the fact that people will live on the streets because there won't be enough permanent housing. And so I intend to work on that issue throughout the district, and I visited most places. I know last year I got some money in the budget, a piece of what was needed for Schumann Hart House. And I've been doing it in different parts of the entire district to try to augment what comes and deal with housing. And I think the other thing is that the state's housing policy has been a little urban centric. And in my current district, and it will change next year, in my current district, there's 21 cities. And once you factor out the piece of the city of San Jose that's in it, the next biggest of the 21 cities is Santa Cruz with over 60,000 people. And so these are small cities that are trying to deal with the unhoused, and yet the state policies really are urban centric. And so in Grover Beach, they're doing tiny homes. They have a comprehensive place in San Luis Obispo. They have an amazing thing in Atascadero. They bought on Motel 6 in Paso Robles. Seaside has the Noche Buena. Now Schumann is coming on. There's some great things that are in Salinas, and also there's even though they don't provide overnight shelter, the women's program that exists in Monterey that Kate was the acting director of at some point has been really good. And in Santa Cruz, there's finally a place for veterans. They're building 118 unit low income housing on the current homeless services site, because once they delivered all the services, they realized that unless we provide housing, we just couldn't do it. So they're doing that as part of the mix in Santa Cruz and have gotten state support for that. So I intend to go back and try to address these needs and make sure that people at the local level along the Central Coast that are actually stepping up to help the unhoused are getting some support from the state. But that leads to the last topic, which is the biggest one, which is the budget. And this last year, we had after having an $80 billion surplus, we had a $31 billion shortfall. And I was budget chair when I was in the assembly, which is over 15 years ago. And we had deficits every year, but at that time, we had a 2/3 budget requirement. So the Republicans held up the budget every year and we had deadlocks that went for 2 months. We had no reserves, just nominal reserves for a year, but no reserves. And so, and the voters had not enacted 2 different rounds of tax increases, which they did in the Jerry Brown years. And so when we headed into the $31 billion problem, we were able to handle it without dipping into reserves. It was delay one-time things. And when we had the surplus, we appropriated some things for 3 years so that they could go, that continued to go. And the perfect example is schools. And I know many of you have worked in education and feel strongly about public education in California. And since 2017, we have increased the K through 12, kindergarten through 12 budget in California by over 40%. And we used to be in the bottom 10% in the medium per capita expenditure for students. And we are now sort of in the middle, moving just above half. So we have really made great strides in education. And this last year, that dynamic that I described about the budget really applied to education. We had money year to year that was virtually flat, but we had one-time money that carried over for 2 or 3 years for education. And that allowed us to take all the money we had and apply over an 8% increase to K through 12 in the local control funding formula. So even though we had flat funding, using the leftover one-time money, we were able to increase, and that went to community colleges, and we did 5% to CSU and UCs. If you look at higher education, we did a bunch towards student aid for the first time in years, 2 years ago, to really try to increase who's covered and what they're covered for. We're still missing, I think, community colleges and having adequate student aid coverage. And last year, we really disagreed with the governor at the legislative level. We wanted to increase UC by 11% and wanted to increase CSU by 14% because there are special needs that exist in those systems, and the governor rolled it back to 5%. That makes it particularly acute for the CSU system because UC has partially an endowment and has other sources and does certain kinds of research that bring in National Science Foundation grants and other revenue sources. CSU doesn't have the same thing. And CSU is really behind in salaries for faculty and staff. And so, as we've seen, there are rolling strikes with the faculty last week and into this week at the CSU system. And I'm very concerned about them having enough money to settle. That is why we tried to add much more money to them last year, was precisely knowing that this was coming up in the labor negotiations and try to be ready. And so I am not sure how CSU is going to do that. They raised tuition recently and want to apply it to this. UC has raised tuition, but in a unique way. They raise tuition by a certain amount every year, and then they lock that tuition in for the entire time a student's in college. So if they went in last year, whatever the tuition was, that is locked in for all 4 years or 5 years that they go to UC. And it's a system that has worked in other places. And it was adopted, and while and sometimes I do not think UC is a good spokesperson for themselves explaining the student aid, because between basic Cal grants and between the middle class scholarship program that we do for UC, whenever tuition increase happens, it mostly falls on the upper income parents, as opposed to those that are middle income or lower income. And so they don't absorb that. The problem that we have is that the grants haven't over time applied to fees, and yet housing, food, books, other things are as much a cost driver at the higher education system, and that's where we really have to make sure that we are doing things. Which leads to a discussion of the current budget situation, because a bomb was dropped a few days ago when the legislative analyst said that we have a $68 billion budget problem heading into this next year. And you probably wonder, why does it get said in December? Well, because of the storms, the April 15th due date on taxes was postponed. And then was postponed again. And I cringed when that happened. It's great for the people that were struggling due to flood damage, but it meant we adopted a budget without knowing for sure what the revenues were. And now the revenues have come in dramatically lower than was projected in the budget. And it's worse than that. It turns out that the surplus that was thought to be up at 80 billion was actually about $20 billion lower. And that is being realized now, even though that money was allocated. So it is leading to a $68 billion problem that is split between sort of one-time money and an out of whack ongoing deficit. The ongoing deficit is more in the neighborhood of $25 billion, but there's a $68 billion problem given all of this put together. And it's interesting because I think if you look at the Senate, at least, there's only 4 or 5 senators that have ever been in the Senate out of the 40 that have been there during either the Great Recession or deficit times. It's me, Senator Skinner, Senator Portantino, Senator Atkins, and Senator Caballero. And 3 of those, of the 5 of us, are leaving at the end of next year. And then Senator Caballero is scheduled to go 2 years after that. And so basically we're dealing with a Senate that has never been through a down economic time or a down economic budget. And as I said earlier, the whole notion of things has changed in that at least there's a simple majority to approve the budget. We have reserves, and we have had increased taxes. And so what we have in front of us now is we're going to have to do some really gruesome stuff when we come back. And if we try to change this year's budget, we're already halfway through it. So we'd have to have cut twice as deep to appreciate a 12-year reduction if we do that coming back in January. And we have to cut some of the leftover one-time money. And it's horrible because a major chunk of the one-time money went to climate programs, and that's not anything that any of us want to reduce. And so we can close this gap with pulling back or delaying some of the one-time money, and some of it was delayed already this year. But if we don't cut in some way some ongoing expenditures, then we still have the same deficit in the following year. And so you have to cut some measure of expenditures to realize something this year, but to lower what the deficit is in the out years. And we have reserves. The governor could declare a fiscal emergency, and if he declares a fiscal emergency, we can access the reserves. And they are just short, I think, at this point, of $40 billion. And they're at least 10 or 12 of that is for schools. The rest of it is for for the general fund. And the analogy that I would make for you is the analogy I faced when I was resources secretary on the drought. Because we had a 4-year drought. In the first 4 years, I was resources secretary, and it was very severe. And we were in the 3rd year, and the farmers around the state said, give us everything that you've got in savings, because if we don't get it, the bottom drops out. There is no 4th year. And yet, if that drought went 5 years or 6 years, we have to have enough money for basic health and safety and drinking water across the state. So we could not honor the farmer's request to just give us it all. The same thing is true with the reserves. If this downturn in the budget goes on for 3 or 4 years, we can't give out all the reserves in the first year. We have to figure out a way that over time we try to protect basic services for at least 3 years. And so we will have the dilemma of how far to dip into reserves. And it means you have to match cuts with dipping into the reserves. And then there will be people that say, let's do equal across the board cuts. Let's just go into every program and do equal across the board cuts. That doesn't work very well. And the perfect example, and I can't remember the name of the program, but I suspect a lot of people on the Zoom will. There is a state program for assistance in reproductive services, and it is paid for 10% by the state general fund and 90% by the federal government. And so if we cut the general fund, we are kissing off the 90% match for whatever we cut. And so you might think that the cost of the program is only what's in the general fund, but the overall program is 90% funded somewhere else, and we have to keep as much of that money coming in overall. So when you look at each individual program, you have to make decisions based on those kind of factors, not necessarily an equal across the board cut. And there's certain things like in schools, if we come up short in any way under Proposition 98, which is the formula voters adopted for minimum school funding, there will be settle up. We will owe it in future years back to the schools. And part of the dilemma in all this is not running up so much debt, deciding we're just not going to cut very much and we're going to run up debt, that then we have the debt on top of the deficit. And so normally, if you were doing borrowing in bonds, such as what voters will approve, the rule of thumb is that 5 to 6% of your 100% general fund can be in debt. That's the right rule of thumb that you're in balance. And this horrible thing happened in the Great Recession, where we had a $20 billion reduction in the state budget due to the crash in revenues. And then suddenly what was within the debt being within the window that's acceptable, went way outside the window. And the state had borrowed from all these different funds, and Schwarzenegger had just issued debt bonds of $15 billion to just balance the budget and have future people pay it off. And Jerry Brown raised taxes, made cuts, and spent his 8 years completely paying off the debt. And so now there will be pressure to go way back into debt. There were even some harebrained things that there was 1 year in the Schwarzenegger years where you have 12 payrolls in a year. It's always on the last day of the month. And so 1 year there were 11 payrolls, and the payroll that was June 30th was moved to July 1st. So that payroll was in the next year, so you could realize some savings. And I kept saying within the administration when I was in the cabinet, and we had some extra money, are we going to move that July 1st payroll back into June 30th so that we're back on the normal thing? And yes, if things really crash, you have that as an option. And in the end, that happened. And so now there will be real pressure to borrow. And I think excessive debt is really a bad idea. And there are questions people want to know, will there be a climate bond? And we were heading toward negotiating a climate bond and putting it on next year's ballot. There is a bond on the March primary ballot, which is really dealing with mental health and housing. And it is finally to provide housing options so that if you get people on the street or you do different things in conservatorships, there's a place for people to go. And part of it is that the millionaire's tax for mental health was done 20 years ago. And a little bit of that, the voters would repurpose for this in addition to new money. And that's what everybody will be voting on in March. I support it. I think there'll be some pressure for people not to support it because we have the deficit. But we need a school bond because we're behind in school construction. We probably need a flood bond. We need more water assistance for people. And the climate bond. And my guess is we'll be hard pressed to do any of those with the budget deficit. We'll have a debate. We'll see. In some cases, if it's something that provides jobs right away, that might make some sense to beef up and feed the economy in exchange for the debt. But if you put $1 in a bond, the interest is anywhere from 60 to 80 cents, depending on inflation over the life of the bond. And it's cheaper to put it in the budget and buy it rather than add that extra debt. So we will have that discussion when we come back. And I think that that what will happen is that the finance staff and the budget staff of the legislature will try to put together the jigsaw puzzle of all these different funding sources and what can we do to minimize reductions and still hold to some of the service levels we have. But it's going to be up to the legislature and the governor to decide what our priorities are. And I have to tell you a weird story from when I was budget chair, because we would have closed caucus discussions of all the Assembly Democrats. And one year we had testimony that people with disabilities, the cuts were going to be so severe that they were going to have to reuse colostomy bags. And people were so appalled by that whenever we would have closed discussions, that would be the benchmark. Is it more serious than that? And I think that year we cut education a bit because people thought that can come back. We have person's immediate personal needs that are at risk here. And so another thing is last year we adopted the medical care tax, the MCO tax, which is misleading that it's a tax. It taxes medical institutions, but it brings in more money than the tax from the feds. And so they actually get more money for delivering care, even after paying the tax. And we had part of it go to the general fund to keep Medi-Cal from being cut. And then for the first time in recent years, we have Medi-Cal rate increases. We actually are increasing the rate of reimbursement. And if you look at Watsonville Hospital or Hollister hospitals or King City, some of the challenges that exist in those hospitals is there's many more public payers than private payers, meaning Medi-Cal, Medicare, those programs, as opposed to private payers like Anthem Blue Cross or Health Net or the others. And hospitals need a mix to be able to survive economically. That's one of the reasons some of these disadvantaged hospitals are really suffering. And so we were going to finally raise some Medi-Cal rates to help providers and the hospitals. And there will be real pressure to move that to the general fund and not raise the rates, even though it wasn't a significant raise, but for God's sakes, it was the first time we were raising the rates in many years. As opposed to cutting that in any way. That will be a pressure that comes at us in looking at these budget cuts. So that, believe it or not, is the Federal Express version of trying to explain in a lay way some of the decisions that we're going to have to make. And there will be lobbying and positioning. The Republicans are already saying, there were increases in the budget by 63% over the last 4 years. That was not sustainable. That's the reason for this. And yet a lot of that spending, for the first time, we're putting money in reserves. We had never had reserves except for annual reserves until we moved to a simple majority approval of the budget. So some of that money went to reserves. a bunch of that money went to one-time funding for people in need due to the pandemic and other things, which, you know, for housing, for rents, for subsidies, for food, for the things that happened in that. And so it seems like highlighting that will be tough. I think Lisa's coming on to tell me that I had the time and I should go to questions, but I just wanted to make sure that you had an update on those things, and in whatever time is left, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much, Senator Laird. We really appreciate your comment. So just to be clear again, we are taking questions just through the chat so we can get as many questions answered as possible. So our first question came from Tina Rao, who says, with all of the efforts to subvert democracy and the use of the recall process for the governor to try to take over the state, what can be done to ensure the lines of succession goes to the lieutenant governor instead of a jungle vote where a Republican that gets 11% of the vote and can still win?
We had trouble adopting that this year. We really, some of us support that. And there was an adoption of a change in the recall process for certain local offices. And the perfect example right now is San Luis Obispo. And it was that the governor would appoint a vacancy for supervisor if the person is recalled. And they're trying to recall one of the liberal supervisors in San Luis Obispo now. And it would be to no effect. The governor would appoint the replacement as opposed to somebody winning with 11% of the vote because there's a bunch of candidates on the list. And we just need to get enough political support at the state level to do that for state offices, as well as what we did, for example, for county supervisors.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from Pris Walton, and she says, with 2024 considered a critical year for Democrats to win the election, what advice can you give the DWMC on how to help increase the number of voting Democrats? And have you considered any legislation to increase throughout the educational system the teaching of civic education and participation of California citizens in our democracy? Those are excellent questions. Thank you.
It's totally excellent. And obviously, of course, I agree with Chris on almost everything in the universe, but those are really good directions and we have been trying to pursue them. And there is more of a move to civic engagement and civic literacy and helping the schools do that. But I think the basic question is, we still have a lot of work to do to convince people that voting makes a difference, and some of the outcomes I've been talking about only come because of the fact that people vote. And the natives, I mean, the population is grumpy right now. They're grumpy because of inflation. They're grumpy coming out of COVID. They're just for a number of reasons. And it has turned out that when the Democratic base is depressed in the vote, that is how we lose elections. That's what happened in 1994. That's what happened in 2014. At times when we lost the House of Representatives and other things happened nationwide. And it's tough because I believe we need to pay attention to local races and we need to make sure that the bench is always there. People are trying that are really conservative to make a run at school boards right now. And we have to make sure that they're met with another side and another argument. I mean, the whole notion that school employees should out students to their parents if they're not out to them is reprehensible. As somebody that went through that at one point in my life, and I'm very lucky, my parents were very supportive, but if some teacher was required to go tell them before I was ready to tell them, that is not their business. And yet that is one of the foremost planks of the most conservative people when they're pushing school board candidates right now. And we shouldn't let that happen. And it's interesting because when I ran for the Senate 3 years ago, I ended up winning the November election by 145,000 votes. And I think part of it was that Trump was on the ballot. But this year, it's interesting, filing just closed, and I'm gonna have 3 or 4 extreme right candidates run, and I'm the only Democrat, and they just feel empowered, and yet one of them's gonna get in the runoff, and a similar outcome is quite likely. But we can't take anything for granted, because for some reason, there's a sense of empowerment around those issues. And I think we really have to talk about the differences that are made. I mean, it's really not about locking up people that live on the street. It's giving them a hand up and giving them opportunities. We've made such a difference in education in a way that we are coming back in our public schools around the state. We have added people's ability to get scholarships and make a difference in getting in the public school system. We have expanded healthcare, and these are real things on the ground to real people, and we have to spend time reminding people that that's why this is important.
Okay, we have a few other questions, but one of them is sort of along these lines. So I'm going to jump to that. And this actually comes from a fellow board member or sister board member, Laura Abahaider. And she says, "First, Senator, thank you for always being such a robust supporter of DWMC," which we can all echo. So proud to have you represent us. Her question: how do we build the pipeline of qualified Democratic candidates? And what's your call to action for us as DWMC, I'm assuming she's referring to, in terms of growing the pipeline of the future?
Yeah, when I was on the city council, which admittedly is in Jurassic times, for 25 years, we did not have a city council member elected that hadn't served on a city commission beforehand. And we should be working with our elected officials to make sure that people get appointed to those commissions. And I think I spent all this time in the 80s when I was on the city council trying to recruit women to run for the city council. And I would hear from these unbelievably qualified, smart people that like, oh, somebody else should do that. And we need to have some level of training, some level of confidence building, making sure people are in the commissions, because the pipeline needs to be there. That is where people come from. And I think once you see the difference you can make, that is really significant in it. And the other thing is we have to tell the story, because I was sort of amazed when I was elected to office 42 years ago. There were either 8 or 10 out LGBT elected officials in the entire United States. In the entire United States, there's more in the Monterey Bay Area now than there were then. And I'm sort of surprised to realize that of the 7 incorporated cities on the Monterey Peninsula, 5 of them have an open LGBT member. That is like phenomenal. And I think in some ways, we have to support people that are in the pipeline, that are self-nominating, and make sure we are there for them, because it's not easy. You make sacrifices with your family. It costs money. It takes some level of skill where there's mentorship involved, and people need to know that they can do it. So I think it's really getting people into commissions. It's supporting people that want to get out there and run. It's having ways that we mentor people and make a big difference so that they know that they're not alone when they're out there. And I think the one other thing that I would say to the club is large is when I was elected to the city council, we had all these unbelievable neighborhood groups that really in every neighborhood organized for us. It's where city recycling came from. It's where all these issues, we got healthcare on one side of town that had gone away because neighborhood groups organized. The minute we got elected, the neighborhood groups withered because they thought we had gotten there. And so we were doing the right things, and we're just getting slammed all the time without the infrastructure being there that sort of put us there in the first place. So we can't just assume that because somebody that we encourage to run gets elected is there. We have to be with that person and support them and make sure that when they do what they campaigned on that we think are the right things, we have an infrastructure for them to feel supported at the local level when that happens. And I know, I'm sure that Tyler feels that way at times, and all the people that have come on to the Monterey City Council. And so that's just something we have to do.
Yeah, you remind me when Obama got elected, he said, we all got here because we all have hope, and now we have to keep working as a team together. So completely in alignment with that. Yeah. So our next question comes from Mary Williams, and she says, what climate programs do you foresee as being most vulnerable to cuts? Another good question.
We really have worked on the transition to electricity in electric cars and trying to make sure that that electric cars aren't just accessible to wealthy people, that there aren't electricity islands in certain urban areas or multifamily residences. And there's a whole host of things like that that a lot of this money has gone to that I think will be vulnerable in the cuts. And my hope is that it just gets shaved a little. It's not something that gets completely dumped. But I think it's that transition. And when it was clear the governor was going to get the votes for Diablo Canyon, I really exacted a lot of things in that deal, and one of it was $1 billion for new renewable energy. And we have 500 million that's already been appropriated, and the last 500 million was supposed to be in this budget this next year. And I'm worried that that's going to be one of the things that was delayed. That was on the bottom line. We signed on the bottom line to do that. And I think that there are some programs about adaptation and sea level rise that might be at risk. And we also have finally invested in fire prevention and different fire and forestry practices. And we're just gonna have to make sure that some of that stuff isn't cut dramatically.
Thank you. And I know you have to leave here shortly, so this will be our last question. And this comes from Jan Schreiner, and she says, would you provide an update on a bill to reinstate taxes on unoccupied second homes?
That really didn't move very much this year. And I think it's going to be one of those things that, and I talked to Chris about this because she was very concerned about it at one point. The real thing is trying to get as many things as we can enacted at the local level. That's what we did with the plastic bag ban. The interest blocked it at the state level and blocked it at the state level. And then once 100 cities and counties had adopted it, it got there. And so while we still need to push at the state level, I think anything we can do locally will make it easier to do it at the state. So it's sort of like taking whatever opportunity we can to push that ahead wherever we can. And some of it is making the arguments, because frankly, some people don't understand this issue. And I think we have to be out there talking about it in a way that people get the issue.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I know that we are at your closing time, that you need to jump from being with us. And so we thank you so much. There are a number of comments coming in the chat with the gratitude for your service and for sharing information with us. It was very, very enlightening. So thank you, Senator Laird, and we wish you good luck in your upcoming election. If anybody wants to learn more about the senator, you can check out his website, which we will put in the chat box.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'll really look forward to seeing you all in person sometime soon.
A great pleasure. Okay. Thank you so much, Senator.
Okay.